Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and your daughter to step outside. Nathan Calloway stopped with one hand on the revolving door, the other holding his 9-year-old daughter's backpack. For a brief second, he wondered if the guard was talking to someone behind them. It wasn't. The young security officer stood straight, professional but uneasy, one hand resting near his radio. I'm sorry, sir. This entrance is restricted today. Nathan glanced past him into the marble lobby. The chandeliers still reflected the morning sunlight exactly the way they had years ago. The polished floor still carried the scent of fresh citrus and cedar. The piano near the grand staircase sat exactly where he remembered. Everything looked familiar. Except nobody inside recognized him anymore. Lily tugged gently on his jacket. Dad, did we come to the wrong hotel? Nathan looked down and forced a small smile. No. Then he looked back through the glass doors. I think I came back at the wrong time. If you're enjoying this story already, let me ask you something. How old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever been judged before anyone knew your story? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments. The security officer shifted awkwardly. I really don't want to make this difficult. I don't either, Nathan replied calmly. His voice carried no anger. Only disappointment. He had driven nearly 6 hours through the night from northern Michigan with Lily asleep in the passenger seat. The invitation from the board had arrived 3 days earlier, giving him just enough time to decide whether he was ready to face the place he had avoided for almost 5 years. He almost turned it down. Almost. Lily had changed his mind. You always tell me running away doesn't fix anything, she had said while helping him pack the truck. She hadn't meant to corner him with his own advice. But she had. Nathan wasn't coming back to reclaim a title. He wasn't coming to prove anyone wrong. He had one goal. If there was still a way to stop HarborCrest Grand from being broken apart and sold piece by piece, he wanted to hear it before the decision became permanent. Whether anyone wanted him there or not. The guard cleared his throat. Sir, today's board session is private. I know. You'll need authorization. Nathan nodded slowly. I was expecting someone inside. I'm sorry. Your name isn't on today's visitor list. Nathan reached into his jacket. The security officer instinctively stiffened. Instead of pulling out an ID, Nathan removed a folded photograph. The edges were worn from years of being carried. It showed a younger Nathan standing beside his late wife outside this very hotel on opening day. Lily peeked at the picture and smiled. Mom would have liked the flowers out front. Nathan folded the photograph again before anyone else could see it. Yeah, he whispered. She would have noticed those first. He slipped it back into his pocket. He could have made one phone call. He could have demanded that someone verify his identity. He could have walked past the guard and reminded everyone whose signature still appeared on the ownership records. Instead, he chose not to. Not yet. If the people responsible for welcoming strangers couldn't recognize someone who had helped build this place, then proving who he was wouldn't solve the real problem. The guard stepped aside and motioned politely toward the sidewalk. Nathan squeezed Lily's shoulder. It's okay. Together they walked back outside into the cool autumn air. The revolving doors spun quietly behind them. A black executive sedan rolled beneath the hotel's entrance canopy. Several board members immediately hurried toward it. The rear door opened. Chairman Arthur Bennett stepped onto the pavement, scanned the entrance once, then frowned. His very first question stopped everyone cold. Where's Nathan Calloway? Arthur Bennett didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Where's Nathan Calloway? The simple question cut through the lobby like a bell in an empty church. No one answered. The concierge looked toward the security desk. The security officer looked at his supervisor. A few members of the board exchanged confused glances, unsure why the chairman sounded more concerned than angry. Arthur frowned. He arrived this morning. Still silence. Finally, the head of security stepped forward. Sir, there was a gentleman who claimed he had business with the board. Arthur's expression hardened. What happened? We escorted him outside. You what? The words weren't loud, but every conversation in the lobby stopped. The young guard who had spoken with Nathan swallowed hard. He wasn't on the visitor list. We followed protocol. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief second. Describe him. Navy jacket. Jeans. Early 40s. He had a little girl with him. Arthur didn't wait for another sentence. He turned immediately toward the revolving doors. Outside, Nathan stood beside Lily near a row of maple trees whose leaves had already begun turning deep shades of red and gold. The cool autumn breeze carried the faint smell of rain, and Lily was quietly kicking at a pile of leaves while Nathan watched traffic move through the city. He didn't look like a man waiting for an apology. He looked like someone deciding whether he still belonged. Arthur walked directly toward him. Nathan. Nathan looked up and smiled politely. Morning, Arthur. I'm sorry. Nathan shrugged. You don't owe me an apology. I invited you here. And your staff did exactly what they were trained to do. Arthur studied him for a moment. You don't seem surprised. Nathan let out a quiet breath. I'm disappointed. There was a difference. He glanced back toward the entrance. If a place forgets the people who built it, firing one security officer won't fix what's really broken. Arthur followed his gaze. Inside the glass doors, employees pretended to stay busy while secretly watching every movement. None of them had any idea who the man outside actually was. Lily tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad, are we leaving? Nathan looked at her before answering. I haven't decided yet. Arthur lowered his voice. You should come inside. Nathan smiled faintly. Is that because I'm on the ownership documents? Or because we actually have something worth talking about? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned toward a quiet bench near the entrance. The three of them sat down. For a few moments, no one spoke. Lily watched two squirrels chasing each other across the courtyard while Nathan stared at the hotel that had once consumed nearly every hour of his life. Arthur finally broke the silence. The lenders moved up the deadline. Nathan looked over. How much time? Today. Nathan's face remained calm, but his fingers tightened around the folded photograph inside his jacket pocket. So it's finally here. Arthur nodded. The board is split. Nathan already knew what that meant. Some wanted to save the hotel. Others wanted to save the investment. Those weren't always the same thing. Arthur continued. The restructuring proposal is on the table. Nathan looked toward the upper floors where sunlight reflected across hundreds of windows. When did it get this bad? It didn't happen overnight. Nathan gave a quiet, almost ironic smile. I know. Because he had helped create part of the problem. 5 years earlier, after losing his wife, he had stepped away from daily operations believing the systems they had built could take care of themselves. He signed reports. Approved budgets. Joined quarterly meetings through video calls. Then, eventually, even those became less frequent. He told himself he was choosing his daughter over work. The truth was more complicated. Every hallway inside Harbor Crest reminded him of promises he and his wife had made together. Avoiding the hotel had been easier than grieving inside it. Arthur looked directly at him. I didn't ask you back because you're the largest shareholder. Nathan remained quiet. I asked you back because you're the only person stubborn enough to fight for this place. Nathan laughed softly. That sounds less like a compliment than a warning. It is. Arthur stood. The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Nathan didn't move. What if I decide not to walk back in? Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Then Harbor Crest stops belonging to the people who build it. Nathan watched Lily gathering colorful autumn leaves into a tiny pile beside the bench. She looked up and smiled as if nothing complicated existed in the world. He wished leadership could feel that simple. Slowly, Nathan stood. He brushed the dust from his jeans, adjusted his worn navy jacket, and took his daughter's hand. All right, he said quietly. But this time, I'm not walking in to defend my past. They looked once more at the towering hotel before them. I'm walking in to find out whether it still has a future. Nathan had walked through those front doors thousands of times. Dime, every step felt unfamiliar. No one stopped him now. Arthur Bennett walked beside him, and that was all the explanation anyone needed. Employees who had avoided eye contact only minutes earlier now politely stepped aside. Nathan wished they wouldn't. Respect that appeared overnight was rarely real. The lobby looked almost identical to the one he remembered. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. Fresh flowers decorated the center table. Soft piano music floated through hidden speakers. On the surface, Harbor Crest Grand looked flawless. Nathan knew better than to judge a hotel by its lobby. Vivian Brooks met them outside the boardroom. She extended her hand. Nathan. I'm Vivian. Shook it. I've read your reports. I'm hoping today you'll read more than the numbers. Nathan gave a small smile. I hope so too. Arthur excused himself to prepare the board meeting, leaving the two of them alone. Vivian didn't waste time. I thought you'd want to see the property before everyone starts arguing. I'd appreciate that. They walked toward the guest elevators. Lily stayed close to her father, quietly taking everything in. Dad, she whispered, it smells really nice in here. Nathan smiled. It always did. She looked around. Did Mom help pick it? Nadie. The cedar scent was her idea. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Vivian noticed the silence but chose not to interrupt it. Their first stop was the concierge desk. Every employee smiled exactly the same way. Every greeting sounded polished. Every movement followed the handbook perfectly. Good morning. Welcome. How may I assist you today? Everything was technically correct. Yet something felt strangely empty. Nathan watched a family with two young children approach the desk. The little boy pointed excitedly toward the grand staircase. Can we go look? His mother smiled apologetically. Before she could answer, an employee stepped forward. I'm sorry. That area is reserved for registered guests only. The family quietly walked away. Nathan frowned. Were they bothering anyone? Vivian shook her head. No. Then why send them away? It's policy. Nathan didn't answer. They continued walking. A housekeeping employee rushed past carrying fresh towels. She looked exhausted. An hotel manager reminded her to smile before greeting guests. She forced one immediately. It disappeared the second she turned the corner. Nathan watched without saying a word. Finally Vivian spoke. You think we've become cold? I think everyone's trying very hard. She looked surprised. That's different. It is. Nathan stopped beside a large window overlooking the courtyard. When people stop caring, they become careless. A looked back toward the busy hallway. These people care. They're just afraid. Vivian crossed her arms. Afraid of making mistakes. Nathan nodded. Which usually means they think mistakes matter more than people. For the first time all morning, Vivian didn't have a response ready. Instead, she led Nathan into one of the conference rooms. Several charts already covered the walls. Occupancy. Revenue. Labor costs. Guest satisfaction. Nathan studied them carefully. Interesting. Vivian looked hopeful. What do you see? It pointed out one graph. Repeat guests have been dropping for 3 years. She nodded. Exactly. But overall occupancy stayed strong. Corporate contracts filled the gap. Nathan continued reading. The business didn't collapse. No. It slowly forgot why people came back. Vivian looked at him differently now. Most former owners walked in blaming employees. Nathan hadn't criticized a single person. Instead, he kept asking what the system had taught them to do. She pulled out another report. This one may be harder to read. Nathan accepted it. Capital improvements delayed. Maintenance postponed. Department budgets reduced. Several signatures appeared throughout the pages. His own signature was on nearly every approval. The dates stretched back years. Nathan stared quietly. He remembered every decision. Each one had seemed temporary. Each one had been made during the months after his wife died. He had told himself he would fix everything later. Later had turned into years. Lily gently slipped her small hand into his. Nathan folded the report without saying anything. Then he looked at Vivian. I came here expecting to find problems. It took a slow breath. I didn't expect to find so many of them started with me. The board meeting was delayed by 30 minutes. No one complained. Everyone understood that whatever happened next would shape HarborQuest Grand for years to come. Nathan sat alone in a small conference room overlooking the courtyard. The reports Vivian had handed him were spread across the table, covered with highlighted numbers, handwritten notes, and signatures that all led back to one person. The door opened softly. Vivian stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. I guessed black. Nathan accepted the cup with a quiet nod. You guessed right. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Vivian finally broke the silence. You've been reading those reports for almost an hour. I've been remembering. She took the seat across from him. I've worked with companies that blamed the economy. She paused. I've worked with companies that blamed bad management. Nathan looked at the pages again. And the hardest ones to save were always the ones where nobody admitted they helped create the problem. Nathan gave a faint smile. Then maybe this place still has a chance. Vivian studied him carefully. When Arthur called you back, I expected someone defensive. You got someone tired instead. Nathan leaned back in his chair. The first year after my wife died, every hallway in this building reminded me of her. I looked through the window toward the lobby below. So I started staying away. It wasn't all at once. He spoke almost as if he were explaining it to himself. First I skipped morning meetings. Then weekly inspections. Eventually I convinced myself that approving budgets from a laptop was the same thing as leading. Vivian listened without interrupting. Nathan tapped one page with his finger. This maintenance project. I delayed it. Another page. I cut this. Training budget. Then another. And I approved expanding our conference business before we had enough staff to support it. It let out a slow breath. Every decision sounded reasonable on its own. Vivian nodded. That's usually how decline begins. Not with one disaster. With 100 small compromises. Outside the conference room, Lily was sitting in a lounge chair reading a children's mystery novel she had found in the gift shop. Every few minutes she looked toward the glass wall to make sure her father was still there. Nathan noticed. I kept telling myself I was choosing my daughter over the hotel. Vivian looked toward Lily. Weren't you? I was. He smiled gently. But somewhere along the way, I also started choosing distance over responsibility. Vivian rested her hands on the table. The board doesn't need someone who pretends nothing happened. They need someone who's willing to build something different. Nathan looked around the room. He suddenly realized he had spent years trying to preserve the version of HarborQuest that existed only in his memories. The hotel standing outside that window wasn't asking to become the past again. It was asking for a future. Nathan folded the reports into a neat stack and stood. So let's stop trying to save what used to exist. Vivian rose beside him. What do we build instead? Nathan looked once more toward the lobby, where employees hurried from one task to another, doing everything right except looking at one another. This team, his answer came without hesitation. We build a place people can believe in again. Then he opened the conference room door and walked toward the boardroom, not to defend his old decisions, but to earn the chance to make better ones. The board approved Nathan's proposal. Barely. It wasn't a victory. It was a deadline with a different name. You have 72 hours, Arthur Bennett said as he stood at the head of the conference table. Run your pilot. Show us there's another path. If you can't, We vote on the restructuring package Monday morning. No one applauded. Several board members quietly closed their folders, convinced the outcome had already been decided. Nathan wasn't interested in changing their minds with speeches. He wanted to see what the hotel looked like from the ground instead of from quarterly reports. By noon, he had traded the boardroom for a plain employee name badge that simply read, Nathan no title. No office. No reserved parking space. Bibian raised an eyebrow when she saw it. You know you don't have to do that. I do if I expect anyone to tell me the truth. The first stop was housekeeping. A supervisor named Maria walked him through storage rooms that hadn't been updated in years. Linian carts rattled because broken wheels had never been replaced. Vacuum cleaners were repaired so many times that replacement parts came from 3 different models. Employees worked around equipment instead of with it. Nathan recognized every delayed maintenance request. He had signed the paperwork that postponed them. How long has this cart been like this? He asked. Maria shrugged. Almost 2 years. And nobody replaced it. We stopped asking. That answer stayed with him far longer than the broken cart. They stopped by the laundry department. A dryer had been taken out of service months earlier. The remaining machines ran almost non-stop. Schedules had become tighter. Breaks had become shorter. Nobody complained. They simply adjusted. Nathan noticed something else. Every employee apologized before explaining a problem. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sorry this sounds negative. I'm sorry if I'm complaining. He finally asked Maria why. She looked genuinely confused. Because we don't want management to think we can't handle our jobs. Nathan felt a knot tighten in his chest. People weren't afraid of work. They were afraid of speaking. Later that afternoon, Vivian brought him to the guest services office. Stacks of guest feedback covered one wall. Positive comments still outnumbered negative ones. But Nathan ignored the ratings. He read every handwritten sentence instead. Beautiful hotel. Very efficient. Rooms were spotless. Then another note. Everything was perfect, but somehow it didn't feel personal. Anoter. The staff was polite, but everyone seemed rushed. Anoter. We never felt unwelcome. A pause. We just never felt noticed. Nathan quietly placed the cards back on the desk. These aren't complaints. Bibian looked at him. What are they? They're invitations. She frowned. To what? To remember why hospitality exists. Before she could answer, an announcement echoed through the hotel's internal radio. A large corporate convention had arrived nearly an hour ahead of schedule. Within seconds the entire building shifted into motion. Front desk employees hurried into position. Bell staff rushed toward the entrance. Managers checked radios. Nathan followed without being asked. The lobby became a carefully choreographed machine. Every employee knew exactly where to stand. Exactly what to say. Exactly how long each interaction should take. Then the unexpected happened. An elderly couple entered through the revolving doors carrying far more luggage than they could comfortably manage. They weren't part of the convention. Because everyone had been assigned to corporate arrivals, no one noticed them for nearly a full minute. Nathan did. Without thinking, he crossed the lobby. Can I give you a hand? The older man smiled gratefully. I'd appreciate that. Nathan picked up 2 heavy suitcases and walked them toward the reception desk. The concierge looked embarrassed. I'm so sorry, sir. Nathan simply smiled. It's a busy day. The couple checked in and slowly disappeared toward the elevators. As Nathan turned around, he noticed several employees watching him. Not because he had carried luggage. Because nobody with authority had done something that ordinary in years. Bibian walked over. You weren't trying to make a point, were you? Nathan shook his head. No. He looked around the crowded lobby. I just saw 2 people who needed help. For the first time since returning, Vivian didn't see the former owner standing in front of her. She saw someone beginning to understand that leadership wasn't measured by the decisions made inside conference rooms. It was revealed in the small moments everyone else walked past. As the afternoon settled into evening, Nathan reviewed the pilot schedule one final time. The plan looked organized. The staffing charts were balanced. The logistics made sense. On paper, everything was finally coming together. But as he looked across the lobby, he couldn't shake one quiet thought. For years he had believed HarborQuest's biggest problem was that people had stopped listening to him. Now he wondered if the real problem was that he had stopped listening to everyone else. He folded the schedule, slipped it into his pocket, and headed toward the ballroom where the 72-hour pilot would begin the following morning. He believed he was ready. He had no idea the hardest lesson was still waiting for him. The pilot failed before lunchtime. Not because employees refused to try. Not because guests complained. And certainly not because anyone wanted Nathan to fail. It failed because the hotel was trying to become something it no longer was. Nathan stood in the operations office, staring at the day's performance dashboard. Check-ins were taking longer than expected. Housekeeping schedules had slipped behind. Restaurant reservations overlapped with conference breaks. Employees were working harder than ever, yet every adjustment created another delay somewhere else. Bibian walked in carrying a tablet. We're already 23 minutes behind on room turnover. Nathan nodded. I know. The old staffing model can't support today's occupancy. I know. She waited. So what do you want to change? Nathan looked across the office without answering. For the last 2 days, he had rebuilt schedules based on the way HarborQuest used to operate. Longer conversations at the front desk. More personalized arrivals. Additional guest touches throughout the day. Individually, every idea made sense. Together, they overwhelmed a hotel that now served twice as many business travelers as it had 5 years earlier. Artur entered a few moments later. He didn't look disappointed. He looked concerned. The board wants an update. Nathan folded the printed schedules. They'll get one. Artur studied him. You still have tomorrow. Nathan gave a tired smile. I don't need another day. He already knew. The problem wasn't execution. It was his assumption. That afternoon, Nathan asked every department manager to meet in one of the hotel's unused banquet rooms. There was no projector. No presentation. No stack of charts. Just a circle of chairs. The managers looked uncertain. Some expected another strategy meeting. Others expected blame. Nathan remained standing. I owe all of you an apology. The room became completely still. When I came back, I thought this hotel needed to remember what it used to be. It boasts. I was wrong. Nobody interrupted. Nathan continued. I built my plan around memories. He looked around the room. You've been building your lives around today's reality. Maria from housekeeping nodded slightly. Nathan took a slow breath. The biggest mistake wasn't leaving after my wife died. Everyone listened carefully. The biggest mistake was believing I could come back and rewind time. Those words landed differently than any speech he had given during the board meeting. They weren't polished. They were honest. Bibian watched the room change. Shoulders relaxed. People stopped looking at Nathan as the owner. They started listening to him as a person. A young front desk supervisor cautiously raised her hand. If we're allowed to say what we really think. Nathan smiled. Jo are. She hesitated. Our guests don't need longer conversations. They need us to notice which conversations matter. Another manager spoke up. The business travelers love fast service. But families want someone to slow down for 30 seconds. Maria added quietly, we've been trying to tell management that one system can't fit every guest. Nathan picked up a marker and walked to a whiteboard. Instead of writing his own ideas, he wrote theirs. Different arrival paths. Flexible staffing. Decision-making closer to the front line. By the end of the hour, The whiteboard was filled with suggestions Nathan had never considered. Lily peeked into the room from the hallway. She watched her father erase one of his own notes so there would be room for someone else's idea. When the meeting ended, she walked beside him toward the lobby. "You didn't do much talking." Nathan smiled. "I finally realized that wasn't my job today." She slipped her hand into his. "Mom used to say listening was harder." A looked at her, surprised. "She did." Lily nodded. "She said people can always tell when you're waiting to speak instead of trying to understand." Nathan looked back through the glass wall at the managers who were still gathered around the whiteboard, adding ideas after the meeting had officially ended. For the first time since returning to Harbor Crest, he didn't feel like he was carrying the hotel on his shoulders. It felt like he was standing beside people who wanted to carry it with him. It wasn't the turnaround the board had been expecting. But it was the first real step toward building a future that didn't depend on one man's memories. Monday morning arrived with an unusual calm. The lobby was busy, but it no longer felt frantic. Employees moved with more confidence, adjusting naturally instead of waiting for permission over every small decision. Guests smiled more often. Conversations sounded less rehearsed. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. Nathan stood near the front windows with a cup of coffee, watching Maria stop to help a young family without checking a policy manual first. A business traveler was checked in within minutes while another employee took extra time to explain local attractions to an elderly couple. Different guests. Different needs. Different responses. Exactly as the team had suggested. Vivian walked over carrying the latest guest satisfaction report. "The early feedback is encouraging." Nathan looked at the numbers, then handed the report back. "I'm happier about what I can't measure." She smiled. "The conversations. The confidence." Before Vivian could answer, Arthur approached them. "The investors are here." Nathan's expression became serious. "So today's the day." Arthur nodded. They've revised their offer. The three of them entered the boardroom together. Walking inside were several directors and two representatives from an investment firm that specialized in luxury hospitality acquisitions. The lead negotiator, Daniel Mercer, stood and offered a polite handshake. "Mr. Calloway. It's an honor." Nathan shook his hand. "I appreciate you coming." Daniel projected several slides onto the screen. "Our proposal preserves the Harbor Crest brand while strengthening its financial future." The presentation was impressive. Debt would disappear. The property would receive immediate renovations. Shareholders would receive substantial returns. Nathan would personally receive enough from the transaction that he would never need to work another day in his life. When Daniel finished, the room remained quiet. Vivian broke the silence. "What happens to the staff?" Daniel answered smoothly. "We'll evaluate every position." "How many jobs are guaranteed?" "We don't make guarantees during integration." Nathan looked toward the employee directory hanging on the boardroom wall. Hundreds of names. Some had worked there longer than he had. Daniel continued. "Operational efficiencies are standard after an acquisition." Nathan knew exactly what those words meant. Departments merged. Persistence eliminated. Experience replaced by spreadsheets. Arthur folded his hands. "The board needs your recommendation, Nathan." Everyone turned toward him. A week earlier, the answer would have been easy. Say. Protect the balance sheet. Move on. Now he pictured Maria pushing a broken linen cart without complaining. The young supervisor who had finally spoken honestly. The concierge who had admitted he was afraid to make independent decisions. He remembered Lily standing outside the conference room, watching him erase his own ideas to make room for everyone else's. Those weren't expenses. They were the reason the hotel still had a future. Nathan looked directly at Daniel. "Your numbers make sense." Daniel smiled. "I believe they do. But they're solving a different problem." The smile faded slightly. Nathan stood and slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the entrance where guests continued coming and going. "When I came back here, I thought I owned this hotel. It turned to face the room. I was wrong. Several board members exchanged confused glances. I own shares. It boasts. I don't own the trust these people have built over decades. A looked at Arthur. And I don't have the right to trade that trust simply because the offer is attractive. Daniel remained professional. With respect, Mr. Calloway, emotions don't protect businesses. Nathan nodded. No. They protect the people who make businesses worth saving. Silence settled across the room. It wasn't the silence of disagreement. It was the silence that comes when everyone realizes the decision is no longer about money. Nathan took a slow breath. My recommendation is that Harbor Crest remains independent. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes without hesitation. We're not finished rebuilding. And I'm not willing to ask this team to pay for mistakes that started with mine. The board didn't vote that afternoon. Arthur Bennett closed his folder and looked around the room. I think we've been asking the wrong question. No one interrupted him. For 3 days we've debated whether Harbor Crest should be sold. It boasts. The better question is whether this company is governed the right way. Several directors shifted in their seats. Nathan remained silent. A had already said everything he needed to say. Arthur turned toward him. Nathan, if the hotel stays independent, what happens next? Nathan didn't answer immediately. A looked through the glass wall toward the lobby below. Employees moved confidently now. Managers no longer hovered over every decision. The atmosphere wasn't perfect, but something had changed. People had started trusting themselves again. Finally, Nathan spoke. If we keep operating the way we always have, we'll be back in this room within a few years. One director frowned. So what's your solution? Nathan looked across the table until his eyes settled on Vivian Brooks. My solution isn't another restructuring plan. It's leadership. Vivian looked genuinely surprised. Nathan continued. When I helped build Harbor Crest, I believed strong leaders made every important decision. A smiled faintly. I've spent the last week learning how wrong I was. The room stayed quiet. A stood and walked to the front of the boardroom. I own a significant share of this company. That won't change. But ownership and leadership are not the same responsibility. A turned toward Vivian. I want the board to appoint Vivian Brooks as chief executive officer. The room erupted with murmurs. Vivian stared at him. Nathan. A gently raised a hand. Please let me finish. A faced the directors again. Vivian understands today's business better than I do. She challenged my assumptions. She listened when I didn't. And she earned the respect of this team long before I came back. Arthur watched without saying a word. Nathan continued. I don't want to be the person making every operational decision. I want to help protect the purpose of this place. One board member leaned forward. And what exactly would your role be? Nathan answered without hesitation. I'll remain on the board. I'll mentor. I'll support long-term strategy. But I won't control day-to-day operations. It took a slow breath. And there's one more condition. Every eye in the room turned toward him. I want an employee advisory council. Several directors exchanged puzzled looks. Nathan continued. Housekeeping. Front desk. Maintenance. Food service. Guest relations. They all deserve a formal voice before major operational decisions are made. Daniel Mercer, the investor, gave a polite smile. So you're voluntarily giving away influence. Nathan looked at him calmly. I'm giving influence to the people who create value every single day. Daniel slowly shook his head. I've never seen a founder do that. Nathan smiled. Neither had I. Vivian finally found her voice. Why me? Nathan looked directly at her. Because when I was trying to rebuild yesterday, you kept asking how to build tomorrow. For the first time since meeting him, Vivian's professional composure cracked. Her eyes became glassy. I don't know what to say. Nathan laughed softly. Good. The best leaders usually start there. Arthur stood. I've chaired this board for 22 years. A looked around the room before resting his eyes on Nathan. I've watched founders fight to keep control. I've watched executives protect titles. I've watched shareholders protect profits. A boast. This is the first time I've watched someone voluntarily surrender authority because it serves the company better. A smiled warmly. Nathan, this may be the finest act of leadership you've shown since Harbor Crest opened. No applause followed. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, one by one, board members quietly nodded. Not because Nathan had won an argument. Because he had changed what success looked like. Later that evening, after the formal vote approved Vivian's appointment and authorized the creation of the Employee Advisory Council, Nathan walked through the now quiet lobby with Lily. The chandeliers reflected softly across the marble floor. Lily slipped her hand into his. So, you're not the boss anymore. Nathan smiled. I never really should have been the only one. She thought about that for a moment. Are you sad? A looked back toward the boardroom where Vivian was already meeting with department leaders, listening more than speaking. Then he looked at the employees greeting guests with confidence that hadn't been there a week earlier. Finally, he shook his head. No. For the first time in a long time. I think Harbor Crest belongs to the right people. Together, father and daughter stepped outside into the cool autumn evening, leaving behind a hotel that no longer depended on one man's authority, but on many people's shared purpose. 1 year later, Harbor Crest Grand no longer appeared on magazine covers as the fastest-growing luxury hotel in the region. Instead, it appeared on a different list. One of the highest guest return rates in the state. The building itself looked much the same. The marble floors still gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Fresh flowers still welcomed visitors in the lobby. The familiar cedar scent still lingered in the air, a quiet tribute to the woman who had helped choose it years before. But the feeling inside had changed. Employees smiled because they wanted to, not because a handbook reminded them to. Managers spent more time walking the floors than sitting behind closed office doors. Suggestions came from every department, and they were actually heard. The Employee Advisory Council met every month, with housekeepers, maintenance technicians, front desk associates, restaurant servers, and supervisors sharing the same table as senior leadership. Some ideas were small. Others reshaped the way the hotel operated. Every voice mattered. Vivian Brooks had settled naturally into the role of Chief Executive Officer. She led with confidence, but she never acted as though she had all the answers. Department heads knew her office door was open, and more often than not, she could be found talking with employees in the hallways rather than reading reports alone. Nathan Calloway kept his promise. A remained on the board, but he rarely entered meetings with prepared speeches. A asked questions instead. A mentored younger managers. Sometimes he spent an afternoon helping new supervisors understand the hotel's history, not to convince them to repeat it, but to help them build something better. His greatest contribution was no longer making decisions. It was making space for others to make them. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nathan walked through the lobby with Lily, who was now 10 years old and nearly tall enough to reach the front desk counter without standing on her toes. The young security officer who had once escorted them outside recognized them immediately. A walked over, looking slightly embarrassed even after all this time. Mr. Calloway. Ibe wanted to apologize again. Nathan smiled and extended his hand. You were doing your job. The guard shook his hand. I still think about that day. So do I, Nathan replied. But not for the reason you might think. The young man looked puzzled. Nathan glanced around the busy lobby. If you'd simply waved me inside because of how I looked, we never would have discovered what needed to change. The guard nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, for not making me the villain. Nathan smiled once more before walking away. Lily looked up at her father. Are you glad he stopped us? Nathan laughed softly. I wasn't that morning. She grinned. But now? A looked around the lobby. A concierge knelt to speak eye to eye with a little girl who had lost her favorite stuffed rabbit. A housekeeper paused to help an elderly guest find the elevator. A manager carried luggage for a couple whose hands were full with a sleeping baby. None of them checked a policy first. They simply noticed people. Now, Nathan said quietly, I'm grateful he treated me like everyone else. Lily tilted her head. Even though it hurt. Especially because it hurt. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Nathan looked back one final time at Harbor Crest. A year earlier, he had believed saving the hotel meant protecting ownership. Now he understood that saving it meant protecting its character. From the perspective of someone watching this story unfold, the lesson was never about a wealthy owner being mistaken for an ordinary guest. It was about how easily people can judge others based on appearance, clothing, or circumstance. Whether someone is rich or struggling, successful or starting over, every person deserves basic respect, dignity, and kindness. No one should be treated as less valuable because they seem poor or because they don't fit our expectations. The true measure of character is not how we treat important people after we know who they are, but how we treat every stranger before we know anything about them. As they reached the parking lot, Lily slipped her hand into Nathan's. Is this what winning looks like? Nathan smiled as he unlocked the truck. He looked back at the hotel one last time before answering. No. He squeezed her hand gently. This is what starting over looks like. And for the first time in many years, starting over felt exactly like moving forward.